Good evening and welcome to NTD UK News. I'm Stuart Lees. Here's tonight's top story. MPs meet with protesters to stand against the possible rollout of vaccine passes in England. Already implemented in Scotland and Wales, the passes have received considerable criticism. Also tonight, we'll hear from the chair of the Net Zero Scrutiny Group of MPs about his concerns over the government's plans.
There's the real environmental damage of digging up vast tracts of Chile, Africa and elsewhere, often using child labour in the Democratic Republic of Congo to supply these rare metals for batteries. I mean, I think there is a better way all round for this.
And the Prime Minister faces pressure from all sides over the proposed ban on MPs taking second jobs. He was ordered to sit down by the Speaker during Prime Minister's question time.
Prime Minister, I'm not going to be challenged. You may be the Prime Minister of this country, but in this House, I'm in charge, and we're going to carry on.
Today, MPs joined concerned people opposite Parliament to protest against the introduction of vaccine passes in England. Similar passes have already been rolled out in Scotland and Wales. Protesters said they are economically harmful, socially divisive, and not based on science. One MP said that since vaccinated people can still get COVID, the passports do not offer as much safety as is suggested. NTD's Malcolm Hudson was at Parliament Square to find out more.
On Wednesday afternoon, members of Parliament met with a Together declaration to stand against the possible rollout of vaccine passports in England. The vaccine passes have been called an encroachment on civil liberties, and protests against them have been happening periodically for months. The Together declaration has been signed by over 120,000 people who say vaccine passports are an unnecessary authoritarian response to COVID-19.
The danger is that we lock in for the long term things which were put in place as emergency short-term restrictions. And if you start to put in place vaccine passports, that's something that could stay for a very long time. And then you start to think, well, what happens if this isn't just for COVID vaccination? What happens if you can't go to a restaurant unless you've been vaccinated against flu or some other disease? It's not difficult to see quite a dystopian world where people's privacy is invaded, where their medical records become the property of the state. And I think most people, when they step back and think about that, can see that it's a very worrying development.
MPs noted that vaccine passports do not help to prevent the spread of COVID as much as is suggested, and in some cases they have no positive effect.
People think vaccine passports will give security and safety, but we know that people who have been vaccinated once, twice, perhaps even 3 times can pick up coronavirus and can transmit coronavirus. So it doesn't give you the safety that the passport would suggest.
They've had them in the Irish Republic since the middle of the year, and ironically, during that time infections have jumped. In fact, they've doubled.
Deputy Chair of the COVID Recovery Group, Steve Baker, says vaccine passports discriminate on medical grounds.
You know, if we accept discrimination on the grounds of COVID vaccination status, well, what next? Will it be flu vaccination status? And actually people do have a right to choose what medical procedures that they have. Now, I think vaccination's in everyone's interests, and I would encourage people to do it. But, you know, if you support COVID status certification, then you're supporting discrimination on the grounds of health status.
Malcolm Hudson, NTD News.
Conservative MPs who are concerned about the cost of the government's Net Zero plan and whether it's practical have formed the Net Zero Scrutiny Group. The group's chair, MP Craig Mackinlay, told NTD's Jen Werrell that there needs to be a slower transition to renewables and that our nation shouldn't be demonising gas.
A group of Conservative MPs who formed the Net Zero Scrutiny Group are concerned about what its chair calls the dash to net zero. Here's what he told us in an interview.
We all want to leave the planet in a better state than we found it, but is there not a better way to create improvements to the environment of this planet? Britain particularly, we're almost behind the boat really. We should have been looking at a nuclear future probably 15 years ago to get ourselves to a state of a stable electricity supply. the whole dash for renewables, it's not cheap energy at all. And what is the real environmental damage of digging up vast tracts of Chile, Africa, and elsewhere, often using child labor in the Democratic Republic of Congo to supply these rare metals for batteries? I mean, I think there is a better way all round for this, and we shouldn't be demonizing gas. Gas is a far more efficient way, much smaller CO2 footprint to create energy than coal.
And how much political resistance is there, if that's the right word, on the net zero policy?
We've got a strange situation at the moment because it seems that the Labour Party are quite in favour of all this. Lib Dems, obviously the Green Party, and the Conservative Party have been very much pushing this agenda. But that isn't the reality with people out in the public. I feel that because I'm a constituency MP. I know what people are saying. I get the emails every day. So I think we have a disconnect between the politicians and the public. Hence, this is such a big issue that's going to cost so much money. I mean, there are a couple of reports that came across my desk over the last few weeks, one by the Scottish government and one by a group of London councils that are suggesting just the cost of decarbonising domestic properties is going to be approaching £1 trillion. When you translate that into what that means for any household, that's something approaching 20,000 or more per household. And that's before we think about the cost of the electric vehicles and all the rest of it that goes with it, relaying the grid and perhaps trying to store energy one way or another through renewables that don't work when the wind doesn't blow. So this is a growing group, and it's quite surprising how many MPs that I wouldn't have considered particularly interested in these things are now tapping me on the shoulder and going, do you know what, we've got to have a decent discussion about this within the party, because this is not electorally good for us. It's not politically good for us. Economically, it's a disaster zone, and we should be looking at another way.
Do you have a ballpark figure of how many people are in the group?
Well, that's always a closely guarded secret. It always was when in my times with the European Research Group. But let me tell you, it is sort of growing north of 50 and growing by the day.
Challenges to the government's net zero plans look like they won't be coming from the opposition parties, but from within the Conservatives. Jane Werrell, NTD News, London.
MPs this evening voted on whether to back a proposal from the government or the opposition on banning MPs from taking paid directorships or consultancies. The Prime Minister had already started jostling with Sir Keir Starmer by unexpectedly releasing his proposal during the Labour leader's launch event. Clashes between the two continue today in the Commons, with the Speaker reminding the PM of the rules and asking him to sit down. NTD's Eddie Aiken has the story.
MPs were set to vote this evening on whether to back government or opposition proposals regarding MPs taking second jobs. Boris Johnson proposed on Tuesday to stop MPs working as political consultants, while Labour proposed banning all second jobs for MPs except public service roles. During Prime Minister's question time, Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer asked the PM what steps he would take to improve standards.
We still haven't shut the door on the revolving door where ministers are regulating a company 1 minute and working for them the next. There are plenty of cases that still stain this House.
The Prime Minister said he wanted to find a cross-party approach out of the Westminster sleaze rows, but kept mentioning Starmer's second job before he became party leader.
The Right Honourable Gentleman is now trying to prosecute others for exactly the course of action that he took himself. And what I think the nation wants to know, because his register is incomplete, who paid Mishcon de Rea and who paid the 25,000? Who's paying him for his...
But the Prime Minister faced a dressing down from the Speaker.
Prime Minister, I don't want to fall out about it. I've made it very clear. It is Prime Minister's questions. It's not for the opposition to answer your question. Whether we like it or not, those are the rules of the game that we're all into, and we play by the rules, don't we? And we respect this House, so let's respect the House.
Starmer said former Tory MP Owen Paterson helped Randox, a company he worked for, to get government contracts worth almost £600 million. But the government proposed to reform the lobbying rules to save Paterson from immediate suspension.
Mr. Speaker, when somebody in my party misbehaves, I kick them out. When somebody in his party misbehaves, he tries to get them off the hook. I lead, he covers up.
The Prime Minister admitted he made a mistake in his handling of the Patterson case, but denies any cover-up.
I'm very happy to publish all the details of the Randox contracts, which have been investigated by the National Audit Office already. We're talking of cover-ups. I'm sorry, Mr. Speaker, but we still have not heard why the Honourable Gentleman will not tell...
Order. Prime Minister, sit down. Prime Minister, I'm not going to be challenged. You may be the Prime Minister of this country, but in this House, I'm in charge, and we're going to carry on.
The Prime Minister is also facing pressure from his own party over the proposal. He was set to meet a backbench committee later on Wednesday in a bid to repair relations with his MPs. Eddie Aitken, NTD News.
Official figures show inflation in October was over 4%, more than double the Bank of England's target and the highest in nearly 10 years. The sharp rise was driven by soaring energy and fuel prices. Many forecasters are expecting the bank will raise interest rates next month. NTD's Al Rhodes has the story.
The Office for National Statistics, or the ONS, said inflation rose to 4.2% in October, the biggest jump since December 2011. The latest rate is bigger than expected and more than double the Bank of England's target of 2%. In September, the rate of Consumer Prices Index inflation was 3.1%. The ONS said the sharp rise was driven in part by soaring energy and fuel prices. Official data showed that despite the government's energy price cap, electricity bills in October were nearly 20% higher than last year, and gas bills were nearly 30% higher. The ONS said average petrol prices hit their highest since September 2012 at nearly 140 pence a litre, over 25 pence more expensive than last October. Because of a global semiconductor chip shortage, used car prices were pushed higher. The prices of second-hand cars are nearly now 30% higher than in April. Most economists expect interest rates will rise to 0.25% in December, as last month's bigger-than-expected leap in the cost of living is putting more pressure on the Bank of England to rein in inflation. The bank warned earlier this month it may have to increase rates in the coming months, as it forecast inflation peaking at 5% next April. Earl Rhodes, NTD News.
9 climate change activists from Insulate Britain were jailed today for breaching High Court injunctions designed to prevent disruptive protests. They received sentences of between 3 and 6 months. The group began a wave of protests in September, blocking roads in London, Birmingham, Manchester and Dover. The 9 admitted breaching the injunction by taking part in a blockade on the M25 in October. The judge said there was no alternative to custodial sentences, as the group made it clear they intended to further flout court orders. So far, there have been more than 800 arrests in the roadblock campaign. Still to come, the World Health Organization calls measures targeting unvaccinated people extreme and says they raise serious issues surrounding freedoms and human rights. That and more after the break. The World Health Organization's head of emergencies program, Mike Ryan, has warned governments against making vaccines compulsory. He called some measures targeting unvaccinated people extreme and said they raise real issues around freedoms and human rights.
Mandatory vaccination for work or mandatory vaccination or proof of previous infection to access hotels, restaurants, and even to the extreme of asking people who are unvaccinated to stay home as opposed to vaccinated people being out. And this raises real issues around civil liberties. This raises real issues around human rights. And it's something that governments should consider extremely carefully.
Ryan said that if such measures are brought in, there should be clear reasons stated and demonstrated as to why that action is being taken. And governments need to be absolutely sure the benefits outweigh the risks. He noted the WHO's position on compulsory vaccination, stating it's not the best means to achieve the highest vaccine uptake. Croatian authorities moved to introduce mandatory COVID-19 passes on Tuesday amid a surge in virus cases battering Central and Eastern Europe. Over the past couple of weeks, Croatia and neighbouring Slovenia had some of the highest rates of new cases per million people in the world. Starting on Tuesday, certificates in the form of scannable QR codes are required to enter any public or government building. They confirm that the person has been vaccinated against COVID-19, has recovered from the disease, or has recently tested negative. Public and government employees are still not required to get vaccinated, although those who choose not to must get tested twice a week. Schools and kindergartens are exempt from the mandate. Several opposition parties are against the mandate, calling it unconstitutional and unlawful. One party announced they would launch a petition to demand a referendum on the issue. Austria has become the first European country to reinstate restrictions on daily movements as police and citizens get used to life in a different type of lockdown. Unvaccinated people are only allowed to leave home for work and essential shopping. People are checked by police as they go in and out of shops to make sure they've received their jabs, with authorities saying they've received little kickback against the measure so far. NTD's Eddie Aitken brings us this report.
Police in Vienna are carrying out spot checks of COVID vaccination status after a national lockdown of unvaccinated people began on Monday.
We try to control closely, but you have to understand that it's still random checks. Of course, you can never enforce a law in such a way that everyone is checked everywhere and all the time.
Police say they are encountering little kickback against the measures.
I think it's quite good that there are checks because as a mum with a 1-year-old daughter, I'm honestly concerned about her. I myself am vaccinated, but my daughter is unprotected.
I think it is absolutely fine that there are checks and that vaccinated people like me can all move around freely.
Others felt their freedoms were tinged somewhat by the measures.
I expected it. Not to such an extent, checking on the way in and then on the way out too, but it's part of the measures. I find it a bit weird. That's all I can say about it, really. I'm vaccinated. It doesn't affect me that way. But to have so many police standing in front of shops, I think it's kind of weird.
2 million people in the country of 9 million are forced to stay at home and only allowed to go out for work or food shopping or to go get vaccinated. Officials say police patrols and checks will be stepped up and unvaccinated people can be fined up to £1,200 if they violate these rules. The country's third biggest party in Parliament is planning a protest against COVID restrictions on Saturday. Eddie Aitken, NTD News.
In France, authorities are considering following in Austria's footsteps to lock down unvaccinated people. The government says no options are off the table as French COVID cases surge. But some Parisians are opposed to measures that would see people who have not been jabbed banned from basic services such as trains and hospitals. NTD's France correspondent David Vivez brings us this report from the capital.
The possibility of another round of lockdowns looms over France, as new COVID-19 cases have surpassed a daily average of 10,000 in the country. Health authorities are suggesting new measures. One of them might be a lockdown for only unvaccinated people. This would follow in the footsteps of Austria, which implemented the measure on Monday. On the same day, a French government spokesperson said that no options are excluded, including forcing the unvaccinated to stay home. but this idea is hard to accept for Parisians.
I think this is nonsense. This really proves that we are right to doubt the vaccine efficacy. As for me, I got the 2 jabs. I don't want to get a 3rd jab. When we see what's happening in Austria, of course, we are afraid the same lockdown will be implemented here. We know that people can't bear it anymore. They were vaccinated more or less against their will, and they thought that was going to be enough. I think it's better if we all stick together and try something else together, rather than split up and have part of the population in lockdown.
The Academy of Medicine suggested modifying the health pass into a vaccine pass, which means a negative COVID-19 test would no longer be enough. Unvaccinated residents won't be able to take trains, go to restaurants, or even visit the hospital. However, the proposed measures were heavily criticized on social media. The criticism likely prompted the government spokesperson to clarify that no future lockdowns are expected at the moment.
Even if there is no plan for new measures yet, there is a possibility of more restrictions for the unvaccinated, following the lead of other European countries. David Vives, NTD News, Paris.
In Germany, the world-famous Christmas markets are reopening. But some, including Munich, have already cancelled because of a new wave of virus cases. Hamburg's market will open, but with a fence separating the food and non-food areas. Only those who are fully vaccinated or recovered from COVID-19 will be allowed into the food area. NTD's David English has more on this.
On the main square in Hamburg, Germany, installation of the Christmas market is underway. But this year, the market will be separated by a fence into 2 areas, food and non-food. Security guards will check for proof, vaccination or recent recovery from COVID-19 at the entrance to the food area, following what are called 2G rules in the country. A pottery stand owner said the segregation policy makes sense.
There has to be access restriction. I think 2G is okay as you can control that. You can't control it in every city, but here in Hamburg, it should work. We can't do anything but follow these rules. It is a way to protect everyone.
This market segregation is the latest example of new creative rules in Germany that is hoping to contain a 4th wave of COVID without imposing a blanket lockdown. The new rules also aim to push more people to get the jab.
Everywhere you go, you show your certificate, and I have to say that, quite honestly, the people who are not vaccinated today for non-medical reasons are acting irresponsibly.
I think that we should really step on the toes of the people who don't get vaccinated and who are very strongly responsible for the misery in which we are now.
Even on whether the Christmas market should open at all, there are different views. The market was cancelled last year because of the pandemic. One market standholder welcomes the reopening.
It is liberating. It's like having been locked up and now finally being back out in the cold. With 4 weeks of hard work ahead, you are actually looking forward to being allowed to work.
Munich has cancelled its famous Christmas market due to rising new cases. One Hamburg resident said it's perverse to have the Christmas market in her city while a new surge is emerging.
To be honest, we have an incidence of 300 and they are still building Christmas markets here. What is obvious is that whoever does the planning is planning in his or her own favour, so as to speak. I find it very grotesque at the moment.
Germany has one of the lowest vaccination rates in Western Europe at 67%. There is still no political consensus for mandatory vaccines, but the restrictions do not yet seem to have boosted vaccination rates significantly. David English, NTD News.
In Berlin, the city's official tourist organization on Tuesday said frequently changing regulations make planning for the winter tourism season difficult. Berlin became the latest of several German states on Monday to limit access to restaurants, cinemas, museums and concerts only to people who have been vaccinated or recently recovered from the virus. These measures shut out unvaccinated people, even including those who have tested negative. Germany's capital had a 65% visitor drop in 2020, and numbers this year have yet to reach pre-pandemic levels. And in Greece, restaurant and coffee shop owners held strikes on Tuesday, seeking renewed financial support from the government to combat the effects of the pandemic. The hospitality sector has been hit hard by restrictions and the implementation of vaccine passports amid a recent spike in COVID cases. NTD's Joy Felix brings us this report.
Greece is currently reporting the highest daily number of confirmed virus infections since the start of the pandemic. This has prompted the government to reimpose some restrictions that target roughly a third of the country's population that remains unvaccinated. To enter a restaurant or cafe, customers must show proof of vaccination recovery from COVID-19 or a recent negative lab test. A service sector trade union says businesses have lost up to 50% of their revenue as a result and need help from the government to survive.
They make us guards in our shops, asking that we ask for certification on whether they are vaccinated or not, while they have taken no measures.
Restaurants, coffee shops, bars and traditional tavernas in Athens were shuttered with chairs flipped onto outdoor tables ahead of a planned 24-hour strike in the capital.
Truly, the workers in the restaurant industry can't take any more. There have been 2 years where either we work or we barely work. We are not asking for handouts. We ask for things just so that we can survive.
Public health advisors to the government are backing tougher capacity restrictions for businesses. Officials are due to decide on whether to implement the proposals later this week. Joy Felix, NTD News.
And finally, Flamenco dancers in Spain celebrated the art form on Tuesday, grateful that bars and clubs were reopening and performances were again allowed to take place. International Flamenco Day was created 11 years ago to commemorate the day. UNESCO included the art form in its list of intangible cultural heritage.
How to explain what flamenco is? It is a feeling, an international language, pain, happiness. It is something that has no words, but anyone in the world can understand if they let themselves be enveloped in the moment.
Performances also took place in fine art institutions such as the Prado Museum in Madrid. Flamenco was formed in the southern Andalusian region of Spain, originating from the 16th and 17th century. That's the news for today. Have a good evening.